Well, good afternoon, everyone that's joined us so far. It is 1 o'clock, and so I know everyone's time is valuable, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And then as the attendees come in, they can just, join in with us. So thank you. This is the 2022 Local Partnership Program Guidelines Development Workshop. This is our 5th workshop. We want to welcome you all today, and I want to introduce myself. My name is Christine Gorton. I am the Associate Deputy Director. I'm the Program Manager for the Local Partnership Program, and my focus is more so on the competitive program. And then I'm going to introduce the LPP team. We have Anya Allenbacher. She is the Program Manager for the formulaic program for the Local Partnership Program. And then we have Kayla Giese. She keeps us all together. She keeps us on track. She's our analyst for the Local Partnership Program. And then we'll have some other program managers, specifically Hannah Walter will be joining us later in the workshop to talk about one of the topics is Performance Metrics Guidebook. She is the program manager for the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. And then we have other program managers and staff that are joining us today from CTC. So thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kayla, and she's going to go over our webinar logistics. So Kayla, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Our workshops normally take place in different locations around the state. However, containment measures surrounding COVID-19 have required us to adjust to a webinar format. Please bear with us should we encounter any technical challenges. The workshop agenda is located under the Handouts tab and can be downloaded and saved during the webinar. It can also be found on the Commission's website. For participants joining us through GoToWebinar, please find the webinar panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. There you will find the audio question and handouts tab. Under the audio tab, you have the choice to listen in via the computer or telephone option. If you prefer computer audio, please select the appropriate box. If you prefer the phone call option, select the corresponding box and dial the phone number, access code, and audio PIN as directed by the automated system. Please note that if the audio PIN is not entered, you will remain in listen-only mode and you will be unable to speak should you have a comment. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link and phone number to access the webinar. These cannot be shared with other participants as they are registered to a specific attendee. We welcome comments and questions from attendees as part of each topic at this workshop. There will also be an opportunity for comments and questions at the end of the presentation. There are 2 options for participants to provide comments. You may click on the hand icon to indicate you wish to make a comment. You will then be unmuted and called upon to make your comment. Please be sure to state your name and affiliation prior to voicing your remarks. Also, please use the raise hand feature as early on into the topic as you can to give the system time to recognize you. If you raise your hand to speak, please do not lower your hand until you are done making your comment. This helps us ensure that you can be unmuted properly. You may also use the questions tab to submit a question or comment. Please type in the topic you are commenting on and your comment. Commission staff will read the comment on your behalf. Thanks again for joining us today and sharing your time. Back to you, Christine.
Thanks, Kayla. So we're going to go over and give you a agenda review. So we will be talking about, we will go over the February workshop recap. And before I get started, the agenda and handouts are posted on the CTC workshop website prior to the workshop. So you can go out there and at any time receive or view the documents that we'll be discussing today. So, and I believe that all the workshop material is in the handouts tab to the right of your screen. There should be 6 documents. There should be the agenda, the presentation that we are going over today, the discussion document. You'll see the current 2020 Local Partnership Program Guidelines, and then you'll also see the draft 2022 Formulaic and Competitive Program Guidelines. So those are separate. And those are 2 separate documents. So those are out there for your review. So we'll go over a little bit about the February workshop recap. We'll talk a little bit, and we've done this in all the workshops, provided a program overview for attendees that this may be your first time and you're not familiar with the local partnership program, we are going to have a presentation regarding the Performance Metrics Guidebook, and that will be by Hannah Walter. And we'll get into the discussion, which will be focused on the formulaic program. And again, the discussion document that is in the handouts will provide you the information as Anya goes along with that section of the workshop. And then towards the end, we'll talk about the office hour sessions. Kayla will be providing that information. And then we'll close with some next steps and give you information about our next workshop. So next. So I always start out giving an overview, kind of a recap of our February workshops. So next slide. So just kind of because we're in a virtual setting, we just always want to give the audience a summary of the entities that are participating. So in the last, the February workshop, we had a total of 53 attendees. And as you see here, it's broken down by the entities that attended. So I just kind of want to give you a brief kind of recap of the previous workshop attendees amounts. So September, we had a total number of attendees of 149. October, we had a total of 108. November, we had a total of 94. January, we had a total of 68. So as the numbers are declining, we do see that the local agencies, and we've noticed that there's some new agencies that are participating with us, that that has basically been steady or it's increasing, so that we are happy for that. Next slide. So this slide gives you kind of the key topics that we discussed in February. So we went over the formulaic programs, the proposed revisions for the amendments, which you'll find in the current guidelines, the section 10A. We also went over the competitive program, proposed revisions. We talked about the evaluation criterion, specifically with the regional and local transportation, land use, and housing goals. And we had a presentation from the Department of Housing and Community Development to talk about pro-housing designation program. So those were the three things that we focused on in that last workshop. Next slide. So this slide gives you kind of some comments that we received at the workshop. And so the comments received at the previous workshops, the comments that need further discussion to help build a consensus will be brought forward at future workshops. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the comments. And if there are comments that the group would like to discuss further, please send us an email to the LPP team. So you'll see here that in terms of the amendments, there was a comment basically stating that the consideration of scope changes after contract award to address project efficiencies and potential to increase benefits. Next slide. This is the comment that we received in terms of the evaluation criteria. The revised or the proposed revisions that we brought forth, it was in support of the proposed revisions, and consider applying for pro-housing designation program as an option. So it wasn't more so a requirement, but the language was revised kind of as an option. So if you see the revisions in the what we brought forward, you'll see that that how it's detailed in there. So next slide. And so these are the topics that we will be focusing on in future workshops. We've brought forward the matching requirement, and so in our April workshop, you'll see that we will be bringing forward some proposed revisions to that section. We'll be talking about the project nominations, specifically with the competitive program. You'll be hearing the project nominations for the formulaic program today in this workshop. The performance metric guidebook you will also be hearing about today. The formulaic program, the project cost savings, you'll also be hearing about that today. And then the competitive program, we'll be bringing forth how we're going to integrate equity, which this will be something that the Local Partnership Competitive Program, the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, and the Solutions for Congested Corridors Program will be kind of bringing that forth after there will be an equity workshop that's scheduled, and I believe it's for April 11th. And then we will also be talking about the evaluation criteria and some of the other areas that we have not brought forward in our previous workshops. Next slide. So these next few slides, again, as I mentioned earlier, is basically for the program overview. And so if there are any general questions in terms of the program, we will be on the line after the workshop. We will remain there to answer any general program questions that any of the attendees have. Next slide. So this is basically provides you the authority and the purpose of the program. So the program was modeled after the Proposition 1 State Local Partnership Program. The program receives $200 million appropriated, and it's annually. And it's pursuant to the Streets and Highways Code, Section 2033, specifies the development of the program guidelines. Next slide. So this basically gives you the program objectives. So pursuant to Streets and Highways Code, Section 2032, the program provides funding to counties, cities, districts, and regional transportation agencies that have voter-approved fees or taxes dedicated solely to transportation improvements, or that have imposed fees dedicated solely to transportation improvements. Next slide. So this basically gives you a kind of a visual of how the annual distribution is broken down. So you'll see here that with the $20 million, there's a $20 million set aside for the formulaic program incentive funding. Out of that, what's left is the $180 million. That $180 million is separated, and it's divided 60% formulaic program and 40% competitive program. Next slide. So this basically gives you a kind of a comparison and versus formulaic versus competitive. So for the most part, majority of the sections are pretty similar. The areas that are just in contrast is the funding, the eligibility, and the project nominations. Next slide. So this gives you a list of the eligible projects, and you'll find this in both the competitive and the formulaic program. The list of eligible projects are the same, and these are capital improvement projects, and it goes from improvements to the state highway system, road maintenance and rehabilitation, sound walls, and other transportation improvements. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Walter, but before I do that, I wanted to see if there are any questions that's out there before I turn it over to Hannah to present the performance metric guidebook.
Hey, Christine, not seeing any hands raised at the moment, and we don't have any written questions or comments quite yet.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to turn this over to Hannah, and she's going to provide us some information regarding the performance metrics guidebook.
Thanks, Christine. Okay, I'll walk you through this, and you can ask any questions you have at the end. So can you go to the next slide, please? So the guidebook is really step-by-step instructions for how to calculate the required performance metrics in the program. And just a note about process, we met with about 45 different experts from Caltrans and the regions. We met with a lot of modelers. We had 14 meetings over 7 months, and we got a lot of really good input from people. We hired a consultant to help us put all the information together in one place. And just to note that this is really just a starting place. It's a place to start and get on the same page, but we need to make improvements to it already. And so this will continue to evolve over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so the purpose is to help applicants. It's supposed to be a tool It's still up to the applicant to choose how you want to calculate each metric. You just have to show how you did it, what your assumptions were. And it provides some general consistency, like about if we're asking for information from year 1 or 20 of the project, if it's over 20 years or just on an annual basis, or if there's instances where we're only looking for you to report like the change or the no build, but not all 3. Next slide, please. A quick note to say that performance metrics are usually a subset of evaluation criteria. In other words, there could be evaluation criteria that are also performance metrics, but there are evaluation criteria that are not performance metrics. So they're 2 different things. Just a note on that. Next slide, please. So here's a look at all of the metrics in the guidebook, and these are all the required metrics. I'll go over them, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but a note is that the Commission is including accessibility, equity, climate change, and public health in the application. It's just that we wanted to offer more flexibility in how these were quantified. So that's why they're there and not in the guidebook, because the metrics are ones that lend themselves to more general formulas that can be applied across like multiple project types. Okay, next slide, please. So just to point out that at the beginning of the guidebook, which is posted online, by the way, and Kayla, can you put a link in the chat to where the guidebook is online? If not, then we can send around the link after this meeting. But there's a table in the beginning of the guidebook that shows you the metric and then the program and the project type that they're required for. So just to note, for example, rail, this is a TSIP one, but in rail volume, which is like in the middle of this slide, it's only applicable to rail projects. So it just kind of helps you narrow it down if you're wondering if the metric is required specifically for your project. Okay, next slide, please. There's also these tables. There's one that has everything at the beginning, and then we also have them before each metric. And these are general parameters that we've provided for each metric that show, again, what program it's required for, whether we're looking for an average annual amount, a daily amount, or over, well, there's the air quality one is over 20 years, but the other ones are average annual or daily. And then whether we're asking for year 20 or for the most current available data. So whether we're asking you to forecast forward to 20 years after the project is completed, or whether we're just asking you to find the most current data available. And then which categories we're asking for, because if you look at the performance metrics form itself, you'll see the metric on the left and then a column for no build, that's without the project. Build, that means if you built the project, and the difference. So we clarify if we're looking for all 3 or just one of those. Next slide, please. The guidebook includes an example of the backup information that we're requesting that you provide for each metric. And this is especially helpful to answer quick questions that reviewers may have when they're looking at your form if they don't understand something. It's also good if you didn't use a methodology that was in the guidebook but wanted to use your own so that we know what assumptions you have. It's just a one-page form. It's not meant to be overly burdensome, but to provide us with the assumptions that you used. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a list of the metrics that are required for all programs. And so it's air quality, the benefit cost ratio, safety, and the jobs created. So I'll go over those. Next slide, please. Yeah. Oh yeah. Right. So a lot of the methodologies that we're including in the guidebook reference the CalBC sketch model. BC as in benefit cost model. It's a model that you put information about your project into the first tab, and then it will automatically calculate a lot of things for you. This is a good model if you're a smaller agency. You maybe don't have your own travel demand model, and you want to use something that's, you know, a little easier and not as, you know, if you don't have your own travel demand model, this model is probably the best thing to use. So that's why a lot of the methodologies that we included reference this model, because we especially wanted the guidebook to be helpful for smaller agencies who maybe didn't have as many tools as the larger ones. So Caltrans will not fill this model out for you. You are responsible to fill this out. But if you have questions on the first couple of tabs, the project information tab is what it's called, is the main input tab, then you can reach out to the transportation economics branch and ask questions, and their information is in the guidebook. There's also a whole section at the beginning about how to fill that tab out. Okay, next slide, please. Kayla, can you, thank you. Or Brandy, or I'm sorry, whoever is doing the slides, thank you for that. Okay, just to note that it would take too long to go through these in detail, so this is just kind of an overview. The next slide, please. Okay, so for air quality, what we're recommending is to use the CalBC sketch model. And so what that does is it estimates the tons of emissions saved per year with the project. So it calculates based on your total your project's VMT, what are the emissions without the project, what are the emissions with the project, and then what are the savings in dollars. And actually, for this metric, you're just looking at the amount, the tons per year that are saved. So if you go to the emissions tab, you will see that it separates out PM10 and PM2.5, which you will need for the performance metric form. And so that's why I made an example of that in this slide, so you can see what that looks like, where you would grab that from if you're using the model. Next slide, please. And then on the results tab in the CalBC model, you'll see a box that looks like this one here on this slide, and it shows you the tons saved over 20 years and the average annual. So for the metric, performance metric form, we're asking you to report the over 20 years the number. So you have all that you need right there. Just again, it's only showing a PM 2.5, and you need to split out PM 2.5 and PM 10. So for all the other ones, you can just use this number, but for those two, if you then go back to that tab that I had on the previous slide, the guidebook makes that clear. And if you're using your own methodology, you could use CARB data, which is called MFAC data, and that's actually what this model is also based on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the benefit cost ratio is essentially adding up the total costs of the project and the total benefits of the project, and then dividing the two to get a benefit ratio. And you can do that yourself just based on your knowledge of the project, or you can use the CalBC model. It automatically calculates it for you, and it's in the results tab, which there's an example of it there. Okay, next slide, please. Safety. So there's actually 4 metrics in the safety category. One is the number of, well, the first 2 are the number of fatalities and the number of serious injuries. And so to get those, you can use the most current 5 years available. And so you just add up the most current 5 years available of the number of fatalities or the number of serious injuries and divide by 5 to get an average. So the source information for this metric, if it's a Caltrans nominated project on the state highway system, it's fairly easy to get. You can just work with the Caltrans staff and they have that information. If it's a local project on the state highway system, you can submit a Public Records Act request for that same information. And the details are in the guidebook, but essentially Caltrans staff who would be processing these requests know that this kind of thing is coming. And if you do have to go through the PRA process to get that, they will work with you to do it as quickly as possible. If your project is on a local street and road, then what we're recommending you use is the California Highway Patrol database that's called the Statewide Integrated Traffic Records System. That also has that information, or you can use some other source of your own. But that's how you get that metric. Okay, yeah, thank you. So to get the rate, so you actually need to find the rate. So then these are the next two metrics, the rate of fatalities and the rate of serious injuries. You actually need to figure this out anyway in order to fill out the project information tab, the one at the beginning. And so the way that you do that is you go into a Caltrans document, it's linked in the guidebook, and it's called the traffic collision data. It's called Caltrans traffic collision data. It's from 2018, but that is the most current one. And so basically, based on characteristics of your project, like the AADT and the area, whether it's rural, suburban, or urban, you try to find the one that's most applicable to your project, and then it will have a base rate in the file that you will use. You'll multiply it by an ADT factor to make sure it's accurate. I'm not going to go through that here, but the guidebook explains how to do that. So that's the first step. And once you do that, you'll be able to have the rate that you're going to use in your no build column. And then next slide, please. So to estimate the safety impacts of your project, what you want to do is identify the safety features of your project or the features of your project that could impact safety. And then for the build scenario, for the rate, you need to estimate what impact that's going to have on your build scenario rate. Like, is it going to decrease your rate by a certain percent, maybe 2%, because you know that you're going to put in, if it was like a grade separation, you could put in signs that make it more clear for pedestrians that they need to stop, or for cars that they need to stop, for example. And there's some examples on this slide too. There's actually some Caltrans documents you can use for reference that are in the guidebook, and the one on the slide is one example. It's collision reduction factors for highway safety projects, and so they show you what the feature is and how much they believe it may reduce the rate. I would ask that you be conservative when you're estimating the impact on safety, because you don't want to overestimate, because in the future, when the project is completed, you will be asked to compare the benefits at that time to what you originally submitted. So you don't want to be, you want to have, a balance there. But that's how you get the rate. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the next part, I'll go over the metrics that are specific to LPP. But in terms of the metrics that apply to all the programs, are there any questions that anyone has?
Hi, Hannah. Not seeing any hands raised at the moment, and we don't have any written questions.
Okay. If you think of anything, you can always email me too. Okay, so for the LPP specific metrics, the first one is person hours of travel time saved, travel time reliability. level of transit delay, and change in daily vehicle miles traveled. Next slide, please. Right, so for person hours of travel time saved, we recommend using the CalBC sketch model again, and it automatically, the thing about this metric, if you're going to use the model, the CalBC model, is that it doesn't show the build and the no build. And if you're interested in the, we kind of tried to spell out the methodology that you could use to get the no build and the build if you want to report those numbers and you're using the sketch model. But for your benefit, we only, to make it as easy for you as possible, for this metric, we're really only requiring that you report the change. If you're going to use the CalBC model, you only need to report the change because the sketch model just puts the change in this one box for you and in the travel time tab, and I've highlighted that on this slide. But so you don't have to report the build and the no build for this one. You can just report the change if you like, but you can report them if you like to. And essentially what this metric is doing is it's calculating the annual person trip decreases and the average travel time decreases. And it also takes into account any mode shifts from your project and any new travel for transit projects. So it's trying to, basically what this metric is doing is trying to capture, if you're looking at each person who's traveling in a car, how much time will this project save them on average in a year? Okay, next slide, please. So for travel time reliability, this is a interesting one. This is a good one. It was just a little more complicated to do, but it won't be complicated for you. So what this is actually trying to get at is those one-off events like accidents or unexpected road closures. So how often does that happen? Because to the extent that that kind of thing happens on a highway or a road segment, it makes that segment unreliable. And so there's a federal metric, and we are using a piece of that calculation that calculates how reliable a segment is. And for eventually what we want to do is we want to ask applicants to estimate the impact the project will have on reliability. Obviously, that's where we want to get to. But one thing the work group felt strongly about, and there was consensus from the work group on this, was that we need to put some thought into developing a methodology for estimating reliability impacts, because it's the difficult thing to do. So right now for cycle 3, we're only requiring that you report the current liability of the project area or project segment, not the impacts of your project on reliability, but you can do if you want to. So anyway, the way that you'll get the reliability for your project is that you will go to a crosswalk, a PDF document that's linked in the guidebook, and it's very small. You're going to have to enhance the screen because the font is extremely small. It's one of the flaws that we need to work on. But it's actually still really easy. So on the left, it'll have a TMC code, but it'll also have a road name. And it has post files to make it easier for you to find. And so you need to find your segment, and then you'll see these LOTTRs, that's the level of travel time reliability, and it will have them for 5 different time periods in the day, or maybe only for 4 time periods for regular traffic actually. And you will have, what you need to do is find your maximum travel time reliability. So you just look at those numbers in the LOTTR columns, in the 4 LOTTR columns, and I've pasted an example on this slide for you. It's the one on the bottom that says LOTTR AMP that's midday, PMP, and weekends. So look at those numbers and put the biggest one in the no build column on the performance metrics form. That's all you have to do. And that will tell us what your maximum reliability is. Actually, anything above 1.5 is considered unreliable. The lower it is, the better it is, and when it comes to reliability. But we're asking for the max, so that's what you need to put there. And the guidebook describes this, but if you have a project that's covering more than one row in this document, like for example, it's more than one set of post miles, then you're just going to need to, I think what we said was to pay either, if like the other one is not very significant, you can choose to either just go with the largest one, or you can try to average it out, like break it apart based on what % of the other pieces are in your project segment. So that's up to you, but there's instructions about that in the guidebook. But that's how you get the reliability number that you need. So that crosswalk will be linked to the guidebook. Next slide, please. But I will just say, so this is actually, the reliability is a federal metric that is required. Caltrans has to provide information to the FHWA every year, so they can have that information, and they contract with a consultant who puts that together, and then based on, I think, HPMS, highway performance monitoring system data, and then sends it to them. So it's based on a federal metric, but we're just using a piece of it for our own state purposes. Okay, level of transit delay. This is a new one, and I just want to remind everyone that accessibility will be included in the guidelines. It's just not a performance metric. So this type of information was previously under that kind of metric, but we moved it. We developed some new instructions for accessibility. So this particular metric, what this is looking at is if there's a transit agency in the project area, what's their on-time performance look like? So this metric is not required unless the transit agency that's in your project area is on Caltrans's list of agencies that have the capability to have GPS tracking. So what the directions explain to you is, first, I look at the map of your project area and see if there are any transit agencies in your project area. If there are, then look them up on this list that's linked in the guidebook and it's online to see if they're in that list. If they're in that list, then that means Caltrans has information on their on-time performance. And so if they are in that list, then you basically just email Caltrans staff and you show them what your project area is on an online map that is also linked to the guidebook, and then they'll look up the service, whether their on-time service performance, and then they'll send that back to you, and you can put it in the performance metric form. So it's very specific. If there's no transit agencies in your project area, then this isn't applicable to your project. Or if there are transit agencies, but they're not on Caltrans's list, then it's also not required. So it's only if they're in your project area and they're on Caltrans's list, then it's required. So you just have to check. And they'll send you the info you need. Again, this is one where we're only asking for the no build. We're not asking for the build. We just want to see what it's like right now. So that's that metric. Next slide. Okay. Daily vehicle miles traveled. So, I just want to say again that there's lots of different thoughts about the best way to calculate VMT. They all have merit. From the commission staff's perspective, what we're just trying to do is be as helpful as possible to you in getting this metric filled out for your application. That was really the main place we were coming from. So we included a lot of different options for how to do that. The first one, and probably the simplest one is to use the CalBC model. That is very easy, and I think there's more slides about it. And that's probably good for, again, like a smaller agency that has less resources. It's really only based on the project length and not the area around the project. You can also use, oh yeah, here we go. So if you're going to use the, thank you. If you're going to use the CalBC model in this option, then all you need to do is multiply essentially the length under the no build and the build by the volume, the vehicles per year under the no build and the build. That's it. So that's very, very easy. Next slide, please. If you're going to use the AADT, Caltrans reports average annual daily traffic through different through different highway segments online. And so if you like, you can use that number for the no build and then estimate the impact that your project will have on AADT for the build. And in this example that I've pasted on the slide, you could use the vehicle AADT total from column J, for example, if you were going to look at one of the segments that is in this slide. So Caltrans also has a methodology that for if there's more than one of these rows that you need to add together somehow, we explain how to do that in the guidebook, but that's another option. Next slide, please. Okay, then there's an example from the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and Darren Conley helped to put this together. It's really helpful if you're a larger regional agency or a larger agency and you have a travel demand model and you want kind of an example of how other people do that, then this is a good example for you. Basically, they do what they call model runs, where they put certain base data into a model and they run the model to see what it comes up with. So they can do a base year with existing conditions, and then they can change their inputs to show what projects they think are likely to get, approved, or their specific project, and then they can run it again to see what the impacts are. If you use this scenario, it allows you to take into account broader impacts of your project throughout the region, which is good. Okay, next slide, please. And then there's also the methodology that is highlighted in Caltrans's SB 743 guidance. So what that essentially says is that you can use a methodology like the one I just showed you from SACOG, but if you are going to do that, then you need to have an approved travel demand model. And there's links to the guidance in the guidebook, but essentially there's a checklist in the Caltrans 743 guidance that shows what they're looking for in a travel demand model. So if you want to follow the Caltrans guidance for calculating VMT and induced demand, then you need to look at that checklist to make sure that the travel demand model that you're using follows that criteria. So what Caltrans guidance essentially says is that you can either use a Caltrans approved travel demand model or the NCST calculator. I can't remember what NCST stands for, but it's a calculator that's online. It's very easy to use. The problem with that one is that there's some limitations to that, and I think I might go over them in the next slide. Yeah, so there's some places where the NCST calculator can't be used. So in 14 of the MSA counties, it can't be used for Class 1 facilities. There's 21 counties where the calculator doesn't apply, and the guidebook lists those. It's from the Caltrans guidance. And then most project types, other than if you're adding an HOV or a general purpose lane, you can't use the NCST calculator. This is, and I should clarify, the NCST calculator will will show you VMT, but it's also really about capturing induced demand from your project. But that's the other method. And there was something else. Oh, right. Okay, so for projects that are on the state highway system, so it's up to you how you want to calculate the change in daily VMT. But if your project is on the state highway system, then you have to show us that you have concurrence from Caltrans on how you calculated VMT. So that, and you can do that through a form. It's the highway impacts form that we've included in previous guidelines for our SB1 programs, and we're just modifying it to show that there's concurrence from Caltrans. So the guidebook explains how to do that, but just so you know, you do need concurrence from them if the project's on the state highway system. And that is, I think, the end. Is that the last one? Yeah. So are there any other questions?
Hi, Hannah. No hands raised at the moment, and I'm not seeing any written questions or comments at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah, and just want to take the time to thank Hannah and the work group that put together the Performance Metrics Guidebook. I know it was a heavy load, heavy feat, and I feel like they rose to the occasion and they exceeded that. So thank you so much, Hannah, for your efforts on that. Before I turn it over to Anya, I just wanted to stop for a moment, see if there's questions, and then also mention that with the draft 2022 guidelines that we have posted, that we will not be going over, item per item on the guidelines. We hope that the attendees will review the guidelines, look at the changes that we made, which were mainly clarification in the guidelines. We separated the guidelines. We also, the proposed language that you do see in those that were items that we brought forth in the workshops up to February. And those are areas that there were no any discussions. There were agreements on the proposed revisions. So if there are any comments or concerns about the areas that you see that have been revised, please send us an email and let us know, and we can bring it forward in the next workshop. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anya, and she's going to focus on the formulaic program, the revisions that she will be talking about today.
Thank you, Christine. And I'll just quickly mention for everyone also that Kayla did post the link to the performance metrics guidebook in the chat. So if you're interested, it is there. So for the formulaic program, today we will be reviewing the project cost savings section, which is section 15A in the 2020 LPP guidelines, and also the project nomination for the formulaic program, which is attachment 1 in the current guidelines. Next slide, please. So before we move on to those two big topics, I wanted to close the loop on the amendment section discussion that we had at the February workshop. As I believe Christine mentioned earlier, we did have a comment on one of the policies for the scope under the scope changes. And so I wanted to put forward this proposed amendment to what we had put in the February iteration of this particular bullet point. So I have put the change in yellow on the slide. Specifically, this bullet point would now read scope changes to expand the project scope due to savings at contract award must be submitted and approved by commission staff prior to contract award. Okay, so any questions, comments on that? Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay.
Hi, Anya, not seeing anything.
Thank you, Kayla. All right, we can go to the next slide. So now we will move on to the project cost savings section. If you refer to the handout called discussion document, it has all of the proposed language that I will go over today. If you're following along in the 2020 Local Partnership Program Guidelines, the project cost savings section is on page 17, and again, that's section 15A. Next slide. So this slide just gives an overview of the proposed changes. The actual changes are in the discussion document. Starting on the first page of the discussion document, you'll see that we added language to clarify the project cost savings process. So the first part with the bullet points is meant to lay out the requirements for recovering cost savings. These the added language is based on the current process, what we've been doing. I did want to highlight a couple of the bullet points. So cost savings are returned to the nominating agency's formulaic funding distribution balance, since the nominating agency is the eligible agency. The Commission expects that Caltrans will review cost savings requests and then make a recommendation to CTC staff, and then it will move forward to the Commission for approval. And if you look at the second to last bullet point, we are proposing that cost savings that are returned to the nominating agency must be programmed and allocated within 12 months of the Commission action to deprogram and deallocate the savings. And then underneath the bullet points, you'll see that we've added a definition of what we mean by proportionally. It's noted a few times in this section that project cost savings will be returned proportionally. So we've added a definition with an example. And then kind of added some subheaders with important details for the cost savings in pre-construction phases. And then we just clarified some of the existing language for cost savings in the construction phase. So that's what I had planned to go over. If there are questions, let's do those now.
Hi, Anya. We do have a couple of written questions.
Yes.
So first is from Kenny Cow. On scope changes submitted before contract award, does that need to be approved by the Commission before contract award or just approved by CTC staff via a letter?
So I think the process that we had in mind is that assuming that it's a minor scope change, Commission staff would approve it, and then it would go to the Commission at the next Commission meeting for approval, but that way it doesn't delay your award. That's why we had put added staff after Commission approval. That was the one word that we had added to that bullet point. I hope that answers your question, Kenny.
Thanks, Anya. We do have, let's see, one more written question. And Kenny did say, yes, thank you. You answered his question.
Okay.
This is from Ariana Zerneden. For project cost savings in pre-construction phases, what constitutes notification to CTC? Email, call? Also, can you confirm this notification would not need to include the cost savings amount as part of this notification, since it would be required within the expenditure deadline and may not be known until after the expenditure deadline?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really good point, Ariana. Thank you. I think what we would require is written notification, and I think an email would be fine. You know, obviously, if your agency wants to submit a formal letter, notifying the commission of potential cost savings, that would be fine too. But I think just so that we could add it to your project file, we would want to have that in writing in terms of like the formal notification.
Thanks, Anya. That's it for written questions, and I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's any more questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the question tab, and we can always go back. Okay, so we'll move forward to the project nominations form. Again, if you look at the handout named discussion document, starting on page 2, you can see the proposed language for the project nominations for the formulaic program. And as noted on the slide here, in the current local partnership program guidelines, the 2020 guidelines, it's attachment 1, which starts on page 34. So I will go through a few slides without stopping to ask for questions, but please raise your hand or put questions and comments in the written form and stop me at any time. Just wanted to say that, and then let's move to the next slide and get started. Okay, so in general, a lot of the changes that you see for the project nomination form are clarifying edits, clarifying the language and the expectations. So because the project nominations for the formulaic program can be submitted throughout the cycle, we offered, we included both the initial deadline so that's the deadline that where you would need to submit your project nomination to be included in the initial program of projects. And then we also included the final deadline, and which would be April 30th of 2026, as discussed in previous workshops, which is the in the first year of the subsequent cycle. And just clarified some of the general submission instructions. Nothing there has really changed. So next slide. Oh, sorry. One thing has changed. Big thing, I think, is for everyone, we are no longer requiring hard copies. So all project nominations will be submitted electronically to that email address. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the cover letter is part A of the nomination form. We just made some clarifying edits. And I listed some of the things on the slide here that have always been asked for as part of the cover letter. So next slide. Okay, so another change for the formulaic program is that we're not going to require that a fact sheet be submitted with the formulaic project nomination. So that wanted to point that out. It's a big change, I think. Or next slide. Okay. So part B is the screening criteria. We clarified the expectations for the project programming request, the PPR, and also the performance metrics. Specifically, the electronic project programming request is now required. New to this section, you'll see on the first bullet point on the slide, and then also the first bullet point in the discussion document under the screening criteria. We are asking for a description of how the project is eligible, referencing the eligibility section in the guidelines. And I think that's it for this section. So next slide. Okay, so part C is the general information. So the proposed edits to part C is to clarify what we'd like to see for each of the existing items. The project overview is the same, a non-technical description of the project. The project location, we're asking specifically like a written project location, including the city and county boundaries. And that's in addition to the maps and photos. The project scope, we're asking that you add a description of the specific scope that will be delivered as part or with the formulaic funding. Next slide. Oh, oops, did I skip? I think I skipped one, sorry. On the last slide, the project benefits, which is a brief description of the benefits, including the outcomes and a list of outputs that match the outputs that you've put in the PPR. Sorry, that was on the last slide, but or not. I guess I forgot that one. Anyway, still in the discussion document. So then as part of the general information, we're also asking the nominating agency or implementing agency agreement, if that's applicable, if they're different, just a confirmation that there will be an agreement between the two agencies. And then the reversible lanes confirmation has always been required. And before we move on, I'll just stop and see if there's questions. Not yet.
Hi, Anya, not seeing any hands raised or written questions.
Okay, great. Well, let's move to the next slide then. Okay, so project delivery is the next section, section D. Just a note here, we've separated out project delivery and project funding into two different sections. So under project delivery, the proposed changes is just to clarify current language. And the only new addition to this part is asking if the project delivery will be divided into more than one independent contract. But everything else remains the same under project delivery. So next slide. So for project funding, again, we added some clarifying edits to the language. And you can see here on the slide and also in the discussion document, we're proposing to add a table to lay out the funding plan for the project. Many of the project nominations that we receive already include a table of one kind or another with the funding information, and it's just a very clear way to present the information. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then we also added an other section. And so the information that's being asked for under other should only be provided if it's applicable to your project nomination. So the interagency cooperation, that's in the current guidelines, that's Appendix 3, the form for projects on the state highway system. that's just what that is. It's not applicable to every project. And then we recently had an instance of taxing authorities asking to transfer funds. So we included some guidance on what to submit if you ever have this type of request. And that finishes up the project nomination forms. So any questions, comments, feedback on that?
Hi, Anya. No hands raised at the moment and not seeing any written questions.
Okay. Okay, well, let's move on. So the supplemental and amendment project nominations for the Formulate program, this is a new section. So all of the proposed language for this new section, we're calling it attachment 1A, is all new. So there's nothing to refer to in the current guidelines. If you're following along on the discussion document, we're on page 6 in the middle. And so what we are proposing with this type of project nomination is that you would only use it if attachment 1, the one that we just went over, has already been submitted for a project and the project was programmed by the commission. So this type of nomination will not have any deadlines. Oh, sorry, Kayla, next slide, please. Because it would only be used to request supplemental funds on a project or to request an amendment to the programmed amount of a project. So the general submission instructions are similar to attachment 1, except for you'll note, and I underlined it here on the slide, that we are asking the supplemental nomination be limited to 10 pages. Next slide. So again, we are requiring a cover letter. And on the slide here in the PowerPoint, you can see the only difference with this cover letter is underlined. So we're asking that you clearly identify the existing program project and briefly describe the supplemental or amending funding requests in 1 or 2 sentences. Okay, next slide. So part B, again, is the screening criteria. And it will, the screening criteria for this type of project nomination will be revisions to the original information. So the EPPR, the electronic project programming request, and also revisions to the or updates to the performance metrics. If your project was programmed in a cycle where the EPPR or the performance metrics were not yet required, with this type of amendment nomination, you will be required to update that original application and fill out the EPPR and the performance metrics. Okay, so next slide. So the general information part of this form will consist of the request that you're making along with updates to the project. So the overview will provide the project title and the implementing agency. The project status is a brief description of the current status of the project. The funding request is a description of the supplemental or amendment request. Next slide. And the project updates that we're proposing are to the scope, the location, the schedule, and the benefits. And then I'll just note that if no changes are anticipated in some of these items or all of these items, you would note that. And next slide. And then you would update the funding plan with the same table that we had proposed for the funding section in attachment 1. And basically you would provide the information in the table format and with your updates. Okay, and then that's the end of that attachment 1A proposal. That's all I have. So I will stop and see if there are questions.
Hi, Anya. We do have one written question right now from Ariana Zerneden. For supplemental allocations, would the commission consider the supplemental allocation date to be consistent with the original allocation date?
So I'm not sure. I mean, they would have different allocation dates, but I'll just say that for supplemental allocations, you would request a supplemental allocation if your original allocation has been approved by the commission. And then the supplemental allocation in the construction phase would need to be made before the contract award. I don't know if that answers your question, Ariana. If not, please let me know.
Thanks, Anya. Ariana did post an additional question asking, what about pre-construction?
I think I will have to get back to you. I think you're maybe referring to the expenditure deadlines. Or Christine, do you have an answer?
Yes, I just want to make sure that I understand Ariana's question. So if it's pre-construction or construction, if you're requesting supplemental allocation or supplemental funds, does the allocation for the supplemental funds and the initial allocations, do the dates have to, or does the allocation have to come in together? The answer is no. So hopefully that I understood that. So if you currently have an allocation, and this would go for pre-construction and construction, and you come in for supplemental funds, the allocation would not be the same date as or it does not have to be the same date as your initial allocation. However, for pre-construction and construction requests for supplemental funds, that allocation must be approved prior to contract award. And if we didn't answer your...
Go ahead, Christine.
I was going to say, if we didn't answer your question, Ariana, if you can come off of, if you want to raise your hand, we can have you unmute and then you can voice your question.
Christine, it looks like Ariana has raised her hand, so I'll go ahead and unmute her.
Okay.
So, Ariana, it looks like you're self-muted. You should be able to speak if you unmute on your end.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christine, and thanks, Anya. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, no, it's just if there's a supplemental allocation, I was just looking to see if the commission would consider the original allocation date for that supplemental allocation as opposed to a new allocation date. So
you mean
that
for the timely use of funds?
Yeah.
Deadlines? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So it would essentially be, I guess, retroactive to the original allocation date, even though it was a supplemental.
Christine,
you.
I'm going to say no because we won't backdate the supplemental allocation to the initial allocation date.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Mhm.
I was just, since this is a formula program, at least on the formula side of the LPP, if that was something that could be considered either now or in the future, that would be something we would definitely support.
So, and I think what I understand is that would allow the agency to use those funds for any costs that they incur prior to the approval of that supplemental allocation.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. That I'm gonna say no. We can go back and talk about that, Anya, but my first initial response is no.
Yeah, I mean, I think even the proposed language for the cycle 4 under the supplemental section does say that you can't have expenditures before allocation of supplemental.
Is this the same as a subsequent allocation? I guess.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
So that is under a subsequent allocation?
So a subsequent allocation has already been programmed. You're just allocating in different fiscal years. A supplemental request.
Kelly answered it actually. Wanted clarification on the extra.
Was not programmed at the same time as the original formulaic amount. So that's the difference. These are additional funds being programmed at another time.
And where we normally see that is if say the agency has a program project and they've allocated or not, and they experience cost increases, and so they come in and request those supplemental funds to be programmed to that project. In the guidelines, it does, and I don't know the specified language, but it basically that the supplemental funds will not be expended until, and I'm gonna go straight to the guidelines because I don't want to. I want to make sure I have the right information. So,
is there difference maybe between local supplemental versus a state supplemental? Because is it the case that the state supplemental does allow for making that allocation retroactive back to the original allocation date?
When you say state supplemental and local supplemental, so what we're looking at, are you referring to the match that goes along with the supplemental?
No.
And we probably need to have a conversation offline, because I think as it stands, and I think and I'm going to pull up the proposed language that we have for that section in terms of the supplemental and what we are bringing forward. And Anya, correct me, is that in your, I think you laid it out in terms of its own separate section in terms of supplemental. So
yeah, it's still under funding restrictions. It's just its own subcategory now.
Okay, yeah. So what the proposed language says is the supplemental funding and the match for that supplemental funding cannot be expended until after approved supplemental funding allocation. So that means that you would not be able to incur those expenses for that supplemental funds until that allocation is approved.
Yeah, understood. It's just challenging as we try to keep work moving, and then at the same time having to go to the CTC for approval. And then, as I understand it, I think the G12 process does allow for that in terms of making the supplemental allocation date consistent with the original one. So maybe that's something we can talk about more. And if you're open to considering that, we would welcome the conversation.
So let me ask you this, and I think I want to make sure I understand. So would non-proportional spending address that, Ariana? So when you come in for your initial programming or allocation, that you request non-proportional spending,
I don't know. That's a good
would that
question.
address that? And I think that's something that, you know, maybe we can talk later on and kind of determine what the and I understand what you're saying in terms of keeping the project going when you incur those costs until the allocation is approved, or like you said, backdating it to the initial approved allocation. So that's something we need to go back and further discuss on that one.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments, Kayla?
Hi, Anya. Still not seeing any more hands raised, and we don't have any written questions at the time.
Okay. Yeah, so the project cost savings section is something that we had discussed and gotten comments in previous workshops. So I hope that the proposed changes are addressing all the concerns that everyone had expressed. So please let us know if we missed anything based on your comments. Otherwise, I will hand it back over to Christine.
Thanks, Anya. And I think I just want to circle back when we were, the comment that we received at the workshop regarding the amendments. I believe it was from LA Metro. And basically considering scope changes after contract award. And I just want to say that we did go back and talk to the other program managers, and that is an area that has been determined that we will not consider scope changes after contract award. So I wanted to kind of circle that, you know, kind of close the loop on that. And yeah, so if there are any questions on that, we can take those, or if there are any questions at this point, because I think that kind of wraps us up, and then we'll go into the office hours if we do not have any other questions at this time.
Not seeing any questions at the moment, Christine.
Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Kayla.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to go over the office hour sessions. Again, if you've been with us before, then you've kind of heard my spiel already, but just a reminder, we are offering office hour sessions for SB1 programming. So these are private one-on-one style sessions to discuss potential project nominations and applications with the LPP team. We do still have a handful of dates left in April, so we would love for you to get your requests in if you want to schedule some time with us. They are scheduled on a first come, first served basis. You can complete the Google form from the link that's in this PowerPoint, or you can go on our website and you'll find the link there to schedule a session. We will then respond to your submission and ask for some further details in order to schedule the session. The invite can also be forwarded to anyone else on your team once we send it over to you, anybody that needs to be included in the discussion with us at least. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Christine or Anya. You can also email our general LPP email box. Again, you can find that Google form on this slide with that link that's highlighted in blue. We do have a handful of dates left, so get your requests in if you want to meet with us. I think that's it, Christine, unless you have some more to add to it.
Thank you. No, that's I don't have anything to add. Thank you for that information. So next slide. And I think this is another pause for questions and comments before I go in and talk about our next workshop, which is in April. So I'll pause there if we have any questions or comments.
Not seeing any. Oh, we do have one hand raised, Christine. I'll turn it to Celeste.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kayla. Kenny Cow, you are unmuted.
Hi, thank you. Kenny Cow with MTC. I did want to also just call attention and thank you all for doing those listening sessions, the one-on-ones. I think those have been really great. And I'm actually also curious how staff has been finding those, meeting with all the sponsors and listening to their projects. And I'm hoping that this will be something that you continue in the future.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Kenny, because I don't want to speak for both teams or both programs, but in terms of local partnership program, I think that they are going really well. I think that the discussions from seasoned, I'd say, agencies that have submitted projects in each cycle to agencies that are not even, they've heard about local partnership program, but they did not have any information on the program. So just to meet with us to ask those questions in terms of eligibility, in terms of the types of projects that we receive. I think they're going well. And I think it just allows us to kind of broaden our working relationships with the local agencies. So I think they're really good. I really want us to continue these, and I know we will. But yeah, that's something that I think we will continue in the future. And, and I think with the local partnership program, we've always encouraged it even before we started the office hours, because we've received a lot of emails for new agencies that, again, want to know if they're eligible, want to know a little bit about the program. They have, funding needs in their community. And so I think they're going well. So I'm gonna stop there and see if anyone else wants to come off mute to talk about, what's going on and how they, what the feedback they can provide in terms of, these office hour sessions.
Hi, Christine. Not seeing any hands raised and no written comments.
Okay, and thank you, Kenny, for that. Okay, so if we do have any questions, please raise your hands or send us a comment. So these are the key topics for future workshops. So again, I want to say that we have our last workshop in April. Want to make sure that we are capturing feedbacks, any areas of discussion. I want to thank Ariana for that comment that she's made, and we will go back and we'll have that discussion. So one of the carryover key topics that I mentioned earlier was the matching requirements. We'll be bringing forth proposed revisions to this section for both the formulaic and the competitive. For the competitive program, again, we'll talk about how we're going to integrate equity. We'll talk about our evaluation criteria. We'll talk about the project nomination for the competitive program. Next slide. So in closing, so today we talked about performance metric guidebooks. Hannah provided us a really good in-depth presentation about the performance metric guidebook. We talked about the formulaic program in terms of the amendments, the proposed revisions, and also the project cost savings, the proposed revisions. Kind of went over a little bit about our office hours, our project nominations for the formulaic program. And so the next thing we'll be going over is, so our next workshop date is April 26th. We will have the Save the Date announcement posted. We have been really striving to get the information in terms of the agenda, the discussion document, and enough time for agencies to review prior to the workshops, to bring forth those questions and comments. Again, I want to say that the draft 2022 guidelines are out there for you to review. If you have any questions, please send them to us. Any comments, please send them to us. And I think with that, that's pretty much what I have. Next slide. Again, we have our email address. Always visit us on the Commission's website, follow us on Twitter or Facebook. You get a lot of information. And next slide. And then here's our contact information. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending. We will be staying on the line for a few minutes for agencies that have general program questions. As I mentioned when I went over the program overview, we'll stay on it for a couple minutes to answer any of those questions. So with that, before I conclude this workshop, I want to see if there are any questions or comments or hands raised at this time.
Hi, Christine. Not seeing any hands raised, and we don't have any written questions or comments at the moment.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So this concludes the workshop. We will be staying online for a few more minutes to answer any questions, but I would say if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Again, April workshop, please send in your topics that you'd like to discuss, and we will definitely get those on our agenda for that workshop. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Hey, Christine, it looks like we do have a hand raised, so I'll turn it to Celeste.
Okay.
All right, David Chan, you are unmuted.
Hi, Christine. Hi, Anya.
Hi, David.
I didn't get a chance to ask, and I didn't know if anyone asked before. Is that when would the fund estimate will be made available for the formulated fund?
I'll let Anya answer that.
I didn't understand.
Yeah. So we, in our proposed schedule, we will put the draft forward in June, and then which is also when the draft guidelines will go to the commission, and then the funding distribution for the formulaic program would be approved at the August meeting, which is the same meeting that the guidelines would be approved at by the commission.
Okay, good to know. So June we'll see the preliminary numbers. So perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Great question.
Do we have anything, Kayla or Celeste?
Hi, Christine. No written questions or comments and no hands raised.
Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes. We'll end it at like maybe 2:35. We'll give about 3 or 4 minutes and then we can end. Okay, so we have not received any comments or questions. So this would conclude the workshop. And thank you so much.